This is when I discovered the extent of damage of this engine. As you can see, it basically just exploded. Took out some parts with it. The motor mount there bracket is broken as well, so that was alarming. A lot more damage than I was anticipating. I was hoping, at the very best case, it wasn't the engine, but I figured it was after hearing the story. Um, so it was time to start ripping it apart. We basically started from the front and worked our way back from the top here, removing different accessories. This engine is a PWG engine. It's the earlier version. They changed it to an EWG. I'm not sure what year, maybe 2012. Changed the turbo uh, and also the fuel pump. So here I'm just working on removing the intake manifold, which has the ECU bolted on the bottom. So just got to make sure that you have everything disconnected before pulling that intake manifold off. Then I can move on to the oil filter housing gasket, which, from what I've read, it seems a lot of people claim that improper oil priming after replacing that gasket for the oil filter housing might be the cause for a lot of engine damage, but I'm not convinced that that's the issue with this one after digging into it. Here I'm working on the thermostat, continuing to disconnect the cooling system and the intercooler pipe on the bottom there, the charge pipe from the turbo. I'm pulling out the thermostat. Now I can work on removing the coolers and the rad um, and the condenser as well. It was quite interesting how this all came apart. It was pretty smooth. And once everything's out of the way, it becomes more and more simple. You're left with, the motor mounts and bell housing and torque converter bolts. But here I'm working on the AC compressor, and that gives me access to the power steering pump, and I can pull that out of the way. I'm not going to disconnect anything here, so just to avoid draining too much oil out. I'm just removing the charge pipe from the turbo here, get it out of the way. At this point, I decided to support the engine with a support bar. Like you seen earlier, the damage was pretty extensive, and it turns out the engine was laying on the right-hand axle. So it's good I put that there because my next step was removing that axle, and just started with removing the wheel, and then basically putting a punch in the fins of the rotor to prevent it from spinning as I break free the axle bolt. And this one has an interesting design for the axles. There's rather than having splines, they have teeth that actually bite into the bearing and mate. You have to be careful to make sure those are fully engaged when you're really reinstalling. I'm just removing the lower rearward control arm here to have enough room to pull the axle all the way out. Before that, though, I got to support the engine because the carrier was actually jammed against the subframe, so I had to relieve that pressure. I could finally pull the axle out, and once I lowered the jack, the pieces were coming apart, and you could see just how much weight was on that axle, one, and just how much damage. I mean, it basically broke the engine in three pieces. So you can see here, cylinder 3 connecting rod is basically the culprit here. Took out a lot of parts while it was at it, and also even punched a hole in the differential. So I'm just working on the torque converter bolts here. Pretty easy to access. They give you a nice big hole. Moving on to the bell housing bolts, I didn't get to record all of these, and also the exhaust. It was very tough. Here's the front drive shaft and the motor mounts, and I'm just getting ready here almost to pull it out. Just finishing up with the bell housing bolts. And removing the support bar, nothing fell, which is good. The engine didn't fall on the garage floor. I did use a leveler here because turns out I'm very happy I used it because I had to angle the engine quite a bit in order to clear the rack, which is something I didn't record. I also unbolted the rack and made sure I could move it because the front differential is very close to the rack, and the front differential is also bolted to the oil pan. So all of that has to come out at once. But once I got it all angled out, it was pretty easy and came out smooth. I was happy to get it out from the top and didn't have to get to a two-post hose. But thanks for watching. And in the next part, I'm going to change the gaskets on the used engine and install it.